Okay, so to prove my point about how when you speak a language it will inevitably change, all you have to do is look at our own language of English. Now remember that here up at the top is Old English. Remember, it is from the year 800 AD. I've assumed up to this point that you know the difference between BC and AD, but I probably need to correct that, which I will in another video. Because people think that AD, because BC, before Christ, AD, they think after death, and that is absolutely wrong. So, I'll explain that in a moment. Nevertheless, this, remember, is the Lord's Prayer. Then we zoomed ahead in time to the year 1300 AD, and this, remember, was the opening of the prologue of the Canterbury Tales, when that April with a sure suit, the throat of Mars hath the root. Then we look at numbers 4 and 5. Oh, is this not working? Yep, there it is. So, or numbers 3 and 4, I'm sorry. So in number 3, when you look at it, it is a dialogue between Caesar, and Antony, Mark Antony. Let me have men about me who are fat, sleek-headed men, such as sleep-o-nights. Yon Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much, such men are dangerous. Fear him not, Caesar. He is not dangerous. He is a noble Roman, and well given. Ah, would he were fatter, but I fear him not. Nevertheless, this is from around the year 1600. And I am sure, even in a small capacity, you have been exposed to the author of these lines, the God of the English language. If you have guessed that this is William Shakespeare, you are correct, and it is an excerpt from his play Julius Caesar. Now, if you've ever experienced Shakespeare, you probably have struggled because his language is different than ours. And here you can see it, but still, with help, with guidance, you can figure out what is going on. You look also at the 4th passage, which is all the way at the bottom. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the son of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house, in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. This is, of course, the same author, Shakespeare, but it is the beginning of his play Richard III. And so, these 4 lines, if I were to ask you, what's he talking about? You would have trouble. Not just because the language is different, but also in using metaphorical language, figurative language, and representative language, you have a hard time. But if you look at it, now is the winter of our discontent. We know what discontent is. Bad times, bad attitude, and if it is the winter of the discontent, does that mean that it is bad times or happy times? Well, most students guess that it is bad times. But instead, you have to think, winter is when things die. And so if it is the winter of our discontent, it's your discontent dying. Made glorious summer by the son of York. And so originally, it had been in the past that they were discontented, things were bad, it was a bad situation, kind of like what we have going on with this pandemic. And all the clouds that lowered upon our house, so gloomy bad times, in the deep bosom of the ocean buried, and they have now gone away. And so again, you can read Shakespeare with a little bit of greater ease than you could Chaucer, Middle English 300 years before, and Lord knows a lot better than Old English in 800. Now the very last one, we have to rotate it so we can see it clockwise. There we go. And it should be something that you recognize. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and the nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. You should be able to give me the exact date, month, day, and year of this last passage. And that is July 4th, 1776. Because this is the beginning of the Declaration of Independence as written by Thomas Jefferson. And what you can see as we have gone through the time period of English, that the closer you get to our day, the more recognizable and the more ease you have of understanding what the language is saying. Because it has been changing over time to the point of where it is changed with what we are familiar. Heck, even you talk probably differently than your great-grandparents do. Just 150 years ago, we would use words like thou and ye and things of that nature. After, where we live in the Deep South, we still use the word yonder, over yonder. But give it time, and that will probably fade out as well, in that we don't use the words like yond. If I were to tell someone, hand me yond pencil, nobody speaks like that anymore. And that is because when you use a language, it changes. And the whole point of it is that it is the same with Latin. We study the puppy. The puppy didn't die. The puppy grew into the Romance languages, of which is English one? No. Germanic language. But we've already understood and found out how so much of Latin, directly from Latin, and from French with the invasion in 1066 by William the Conqueror, has come and invaded our language. Now, that same dotted line I could also draw from Greek. So I could dot it as well. Because a lot of, that's a crooked line if I've ever seen one, that is the same way in which so many of those Greek words come into our language as well. All you have to do is look at the current situation that we are in. For example, it's a pandemic. Well, it's from Greek. In that, in science, in medicine, in so many aspects of our society, civilization, we go to these languages, these classical languages. The study of Latin and Greek and their culture is known as the discipline of classics. We go to these classics for so much of our language when we make up these words. So if you break down, and thus we learn that pandemic, remember, is a derivative, which means that it comes from other words in Greek. Or it could be derivatives from Latin. Lots of them are out there. And I'm going to give you an example of it. Now, another term that you need to be familiar with is not only derivative, but if I give you an English word and I explain to you its derivation, why that word's origin is what it is, I am explaining to you the etymology. Now be sure to pronounce it correctly. If you were to say entomology, that's the study of insects, and that's not what we're talking about whatsoever. Instead, we're talking about etymology. So the derivative is the word itself that has derived. Etymology is the term for explaining its origins. So I'm telling you that pandemic is a derivative, but I'm about to explain its etymology. So if you take the word pandemic, it actually has two parts to it. Pandemic. The word pan, is the Greek word that means all. Now, you would have trouble if I were to write that on the board pronouncing it, because Greek uses an entirely different alphabet. I teach Greek here at Eastside to seniors who have taken Latin 1, Latin 2, and AP Latin, and then they have the opportunity to learn Greek. But to learn Greek, you have to learn a whole new alphabet. And there you have pan. Pan means all. Demic comes from the word demos. And that is the word that means people. And so we are currently in a situation in which the coronavirus is not just affecting part of the world. It is affecting all people. And that's what makes it a pandemic. If it had remained isolated in the area where it's begun, or even only in that part of the world, let's say Asia, it would not be a pandemic because it would not be all people. Instead, it would be an epidemic. An epi, which is again Greek, would be upon a particular people. But since this is something that is worldwide and affecting everybody around the globe, it is indeed a pandemic. Now, there is one more word that I would like you to be familiar with. a term. And that last term is a cognate. Now, if you note that if I were learning a language, and that language is an Indo-European language, I would have an easier time of it if I were to try to learn a language that was non-Indo-European. Why? Because I would be able to see some similarities, because if I'm learning Russian, if I'm learning Armenian, if I'm learning Hindi, which originally came from another language called Sanskrit, and that's why it's called Indo-European, the languages of Europe and some of the subcontinent, they are all going to have similarities, much in the way that you and your family have similarities because of your genetic composition. But if I were to try to learn Native American languages, if I were to learn some of the languages of Asia, the Sino languages, or Japanese, Mandarin, if I were to learn languages of Africa, because they are not Indo-European, it might be more difficult for me, simply because it would be so much more different, because they don't have that commonality belonging to the same family. Now, in and of itself, I can also tell you that if I am a Spanish speaker, it is going to be easier for me to learn Portuguese than if I were a Spanish speaker and I want to learn Albanian. Why? Because much in the same way that you are closer in your genetic composition to your brother than to your third cousin, that kind of closeness makes a difference as well. And so you can see the nature of these Romance languages and their commonality, and you can even see the nature of words from Latin, Romance languages, Germanic, and so forth and so on, that would be similar or related, and we call those words cognates. So for example, I'll give you the word for dad. We can start out with the Latin word for dad. The Latin word for dad is pater. Now, if you wanted to look at, let's say, the Spanish word for dad, it is padre. And those words, since they are related to each other, they are called cognates. Now, we can also make that further. For example, let's jump out of the Romance language world and Latin and into the Germanic world. Let's go for the German word for father. It is Vater. But you can see the way that it is pronounced. Make the P sound, pa 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 pa. Make the V sound, v v v v v. They are what we call labial sounds because we use our lips. But do you see the similarities? Pater, Vater. That's because even though Latin, Germanic, different, they both belong to Indo-European. And thus, it's easy to see how they are related within that same family. Now, English is a Germanic language. What's the English word for dad? Oh, and an aside as well, what do we get from Vater? Well, if you've ever watched any of the Star Wars films, you know that the main and greatest character is, of course, the father of Luke Skywalker. And what is his name? Darth Daddy. Darth Vader. Do you see? That's why he has the name. You go to English, make another sound that's a labial sound, f-f-f-f-f, and you get Vater. And you can see how, since Spanish, Latin, German, and English all belong to this family, they are words that are related, and thus an example of cognates. Now, of course, I left out the sound of father, but at its very root, you can see what they are. So, quickly to review, derivatives. Derivatives are those words that we have that come from other words, they derive. Etymology is the explanation or the study of word origins. So as an example, pandemic is a derivative, but when I explain how, I'm giving you its origin or etymology. And due to the fact that they all belong into this larger family, these four words are all related to each other, as you can see, and thus They are called cognates. So, the big family, Indo-European. English, what we speak, is a Germanic language, but heavily influenced by Latin, which is what makes Latin so valuable. And then finally, you have these languages, which prove that Latin is not dead. It merely grew up into other things, because as you speak a language, what does it do? Changes. All right, that's it.